So I think the important thing to note first is that basically this show emerges out of my inexpertise. I am trained as an ecological poet. That's the only thing I really know anything about, that and school board policy. But otherwise, I'm kind of a dabbler. And so this show kind of emerges out of that space. Though I think it really emerges out of the education that I got when I was at Brown University in the Urban Environmental Lab, which is a very intensely interdisciplinary program. And I think that kind of like both fit my brain, but kind of wired me to really sort of like really want to sort of see the kind of connections between things. So sort of what you are seeing here is kind of like a citizen historian, kind of like an artifact collector, a convener. That's kind of what you get a little bit of a glimpse of. I think it's also important to understand that as I was curating the show, I was definitely approaching it through the lens of poetry. So I don't come from a background of visual art. I'm trained as a poet. And so that is those sort of preoccupations, I think you can sort of find throughout the way in which I curated the show and the way in which I engaged with the different artists that were part of this. I'm particularly interested in this show about what happens between works of art and their physical manifestations and the resonance of those works in the mind of the person who's witnessing them. So really at the heart of this is my obsession with St. Amelia's College of Speculative Timbre, which, as we all know, burned down in 1996 after existing for many years. It's hard to exactly pin down when the college was created, but maybe 100 years. It remains a little vague. But my obsession with St. Amelia's really started with, well, my mother did not want me to go to the Joe Kubert School of Cartoon and Graphic Art in New Jersey. I wanted to be a comic book artist. That was what I was intent on being, but my mom was certain that the Joe Kubert School of Cartoon and Graphic Art was like the second story above a gas station somewhere in New Jersey, and she sort of said you could not go there, but weirdly, she was open to the idea of me attending St. Amelia's. I think because they had a really strong field hockey program. And my mom was really big into field hockey. So I was planning on attending St. Amelia's, and I wanted to go there because I wanted to study with a certain professor who was there, Professor Sal Glax. And Glax's expertise was in the areas of superfiction and world building. So that was sort of, I don't know why at the age of 16, 17, that's what I thought I wanted to do, but I had encountered it, and I thought that would just be really amazing. I love that idea of this idea of superfiction, of sort of a hybrid reality that you could inhabit and that was created for you by an artist or artists together. So I was sort of fascinated by the work that Sal Glax was doing with the works of Iris Hausler and her Florence Hazard project. These two abandoned studios that were found containing the work of Hazard's complex legacy of paintings and textile work. Another thing that Glax was very interested in was the work of Gerolf Steiner, who through the 1900s he created an entire species of kind of rodent that he convinced a variety of folks actually existed and kind of built a sort of world around that. So I was really excited to study with Glax and had my application all together, but then the college burned down. So I couldn't go there. So instead I went to Brown, where I'm glad that I did because I met my wife, Anna, there. I don't think St. Amelia's was really on your radar at that point. You were on a different path. I'd become aware of St. Amelia's originally through the unattributed recordings that are simply called Provocation 19 that were done on the Moog Model 10 synthesizer. There was these recordings that were circulated on cassette tape that were from poet Ruth Stone, famous Vermont poet, her book release party for her book Tenacity. in 1971. And I'd heard those recordings and just loved them, and I was like, wherever these things were recorded, I have to be there. And I happened to mention this college at one point, mention this sort of fascination to Harry Stubbs, who was a biology teacher at the college where I went. And he said, hello, children, that belong to me. I'd mentioned to Harry that I was interested in this college, and he's like, well, I went up to St. Amelia's. I taught a class on world building up there, not as a biology teacher, but as a science fiction writer, because Harry also wrote under the pseudonym Hal Clement, and sort of had spent some time at St. Amelia's, and sort of I was like, this sounds like an amazing place. So again, I sort of forgot about St. Amelia's for a while, and then in 2016, when I moved back from Thailand, I kind of accidentally stumbled back into it. I was looking for a copy of, I'd sold most of my books in Thailand, and I'd ordered a copy of Borges' Labyrinths, and I got it in the mail order from an online used bookstore. And I was going through it, and I opened it up, and I found that it actually was from the Amichnite Library at St. Amelia's. And I was sort of like, this thing was like, oh. And so since then, for the last 7 years, I've been madly collecting artifacts from the college. This was the start of it. I was then able to acquire the door that was part of the Anti-Urban Environmental Laboratory, and other artifacts such as the detestable electrical machine there, and also over behind you here, these unidentified objects that I've not been able to yet figure out exactly where they're from. So that's been sort of the last 7 years of my life, has been this kind of obsession with St. Amelia's. I think the only other thing I want to say is kind of a way of kicking off is that the term speculative timbre kind of sends a lot of folks spinning, because timbre itself sends folks spinning, and then what the hell is speculative timbre? So I thought I would just sort of talk a little bit about that to kind of get going, because I would like to say that in all of my researches I've been able to figure out exactly why the college was created to investigate speculative timbre, but I have not been able to actually figure out why they initially wanted to create that, and why in the late 1800s they thought that people would want to go to a college like that in the hills of Vermont. But never mind. Timbre is often sometimes known as tone color. And there is a sort of continuing debate in the musical community about what exactly timbre is. Is it something that lives in a particular object, a particular musical instrument, or is it something that is only really a phenomena that exists in your mind? And musicians and musicologists and composers have known about timbre, and it's been very important to musicology for a long time, but it's remained this sort of enigmatic thing. And so my thought is that's probably why the college was created, to kind of investigate that enigma. The sort of the best definition of timbre that has sort of like lingered is the polymath Hermann von Helmholtz in 1877 defined timbre as, quote, the peculiarity which distinguishes the musical tone of a violin from that of a flute, or that of a clarinet, or that of the human voice, when all of these instruments produce the same note at the same pitch. So imagine an instrument all the instruments are playing a middle C. It's wide as a piano, sound different from a trumpet, sound different from a clarinet. What is the quality of that? So there's sort of debate has raged. I mean, I know you're all huge timbre heads. You all, I don't need to tell you all this. So for example, in the American National Standards Institute in 1960 took a stab at it, trying to figure out like how could they define it. So they defined it as that attribute of auditory sensations, quote, which enables a listener to judge that two non-identical sounds similarly presented and having the same loudness and pitch are dissimilar. In 1990, Bregman said, this is, of course, no definition at all. The problem with timbre is it is a name for an ill-defined wastebasket category. And that has sort of, again, sort of lingered. It's this idea of it's sort of like everything except for pitch and loudness, that's what timbre is. And that, again, I'm sure that is sort of partially what fascinated the folks who created this college, but it is what fascinated me. And I think part of it is this idea that some people believe that you can only really understand timbre as something that exists in the mind of the listener. It's not anything that you can actually compose for on the page. It's something that only materializes in the mind. So I think as I thought about for the college, I was like, well, how does this correlate in terms of poetics, in terms of visual art, in terms of ecology? What are the attributes of a poem that only exists in the mind of the reader, but it's not in the actual text? What of a painting can only be said to exist in the mind of the viewer, but is not actually in the painting? What aspects of the non-human world exist only in the mind of the hawk, or the raccoon, or the turkey vulture, or the white-tailed deer? And so I think that maybe, as I've sort of begun to understand a bit more about the college, what was sort of essential to it. I could tell you a little bit more about how in the last years of the college, they had started to kind of get into some of the, what only now are becoming some of the sort of vanguard of ideas about timbre that are regarded as sort of cutting edge. For example, the idea of klangfarben harmony, the idea of polyphonic timbre music. It's only really being explored now. But I think I just want you to know that, again, when the college burned down, they were onto something that, again, we're only really picking up now, about 30 years later. Therein ends the first station. I think what I want to talk about in here are a couple of things. The first is you'll see throughout the space that there are the provocations. So if anybody, if folks really know anything about St. Amelia, sort of in kind of I don't know, non-dorky kind of timbre culture, it's because they know about this through the provocations. So the provocations emerged, and Suzanne, you could say a little bit more about this maybe at some point about where the provocations really emerged, because Suzanne is really an expert in the salon of Miss Wilda. Why am I blanking on her last name?
Andrew Wilda.
Andrew Wilda. Sorry, Ms. Andrew Wilda, who many sort of attribute the emergence of the provocations from. But basically, in the 40s and 50s, these artistic prompts started to emerge around campus. They'd be kind of pinned up, kind of like this. So this is Provocation 173, and there's provocations all around. They're known to be about 746 provocations, though not all of them have been documented, though we know that there are that many of them in existence. When they started first emerging at the college, folks were just kind of bewildered and didn't kind of know what to do with them, but they all sort of like provided a little bit of like a sort of a potential for sort of the creation of something. By the 50s and 60s, if I'm correct, Suzanne, most of the professors in their classes, whenever one of these provocations emerged, they would start immediately, they would switch their curriculum and start engaging that work directly. So for example, I don't remember, we don't know exactly when these emerged, but for example, this one, Provocation 173, says, tune in to the next broadcast performance of the Tlon Radio Orchestra, or listen to a taped symphony at the Amakmite so long as it's after dark. Place something in ruins on the floor before you. When the swallows appear, desperate to save what it is in its state of raw ruination, capture one. Hold it close. The timbre of its blood and prayer beneath the feathers will slowly attune to the cello or the bassoon or bass mandolin. When this happens, accept what the music has caused to be replaced and let the bird go. Render this absence in your chosen medium. And so from there, each of the different professors and the students would sort of then be starting creating work. This one particularly sort of allows for the different kind of mediums to be engaged. But those provocations resulted in a number of works that I'm sure you're familiar with. Pablo Amore's painting Gone Bird, number 594, or Chan Kia's Spectrum of Forgiveness, Dragonfly Notations, or for all of you synth heads out there, the Eurorack module, the Hurt module was created out of one of those materials. So you can see a number of those. I've been able to collect, I think maybe I have around
35.
I don't have that many of them. I have some of them. My most recent, so Amelie Grilka gave me her father's, I'm just going to put this down here, gave me her father's recipe box. And there was a sequence of these provocations which were written on the backs of handwritten recipes that were circulating in the Vermont community. So there was only one of these that were actually in this when I got it, but I've been able to collect a few others. So for example, on the back of prune bread, which is attributed to Mrs. Horace Albright. I think I put this on Instagram, so if you actually want the recipe, you can find it there. But, so this one says, provocation number 54, court someone in your intro to climate class. Conceive of a scion of a golden stone fruit who may become your daughter. Cultivate this sapling for some years until you find yourself in a green rainstorm. Then. So some of them end on a kind of like cliffhanger, like, and they can kind of like connect maybe to like other ones. On the back of hot milk sponge cake, this one says, delirious with fatigue after your August exams, loose strife the latent white supremacy still eating into the fourth chamber of your heart. Aster the goldenrod, kiss the cellist on his autumn mouth. Flirt with Mixolydian elderberries until all the violence done in your name can translate you into atonement. So some of them get a little intense. So I've been gradually sort of collecting those. And it's been interesting to see folks who weren't as familiar come through and start to actually produce new works based on encountering the provocations in the show.
Colin, I would add that some of that, if you know this, you may pick up on Fluxus there. How much has this influenced Fluxus, Yoko Ono, Grapefruit, for example?
Yeah. So we had an evening maybe last week, 2 weeks ago, where we had a salon literary gathering, and Suzanne gave a talk on the history of one of the literary salons that was created by Miss Andrew Wilda, who again was sort of regarded as being sort of one of the sort of parts here, and sort of the kind of fractaling, kind of how did these influences of Saint Amelia potentially touch other aspects of the art world that we're familiar with. The other thing I want to note in here, the work by the Bermudian artist Jordan Carey, who did these works, engages sort of a part of the history of Saint Amelia's that the college like to think of itself as being a real sort of progressive place, sort of like through the 60s, 70s, 80s, but like most institutions that are really sort of founded in white supremacy are not really fully able to see their blind spots. And so one of the things that Jordan pointed out was when he attended the college, there was sort of an inability of the college to kind of acknowledge the depth of the history of how that college had come to be, and particularly in the cemetery at the college, the history of the enslaved folks that had labored there and kind of made the college what it was. So as Jordan writes, he writes, quote, St. Amelia's was designed to hold me and facilitate my growth, but it is at the same time content to have an uninterrogated relationship with the unnamed and abused bodies on their property. The anonymity of these haphazardly placed graves only polishes the mirror I use to see myself in them. Each uneven inch these stones sink into the ground reperforms the expendable relationship that St. Amelia's had with them. So it's really beautiful and striking work. And what also struck me is that another artist who's in the show, Professor Adam Rosenblatt of Duke, who created some of the zines that you'll see at the end of the piece. His most recent book is called Cemetery Citizens. And this is a book that explores the history of African-American cemeteries, predominantly in the South, and the way in which different communities have come together to kind of care for those spaces and to become kind of a more sort of active sort of rememberers of those spaces. And Rosenblatt writes at one point, he cites Donna Haraway's book Staying with the Trouble in this. He says, most of the time we think of cemeteries as places to mark the end of a life or of lives in aggregate. In telling the stories of people who came together in cemeteries, this book is less about grief or the past than it is about the, quote, and this is where he's quoting Haraway, attentive practices of thought, rage, and care. happening right now in places of the marginalized dead. And so I think it's really interesting that even though this is not in any way what Adam's work was sort of engaging as part of the show, I think it's interesting to think about this show, but also sort of some of my continuing research into St. Amelia's as how are folks who either were taught at St. Amelia's or who worked there or who were sort of in the wake of their influence, how are they in a process of attentive practices of thought, rage, and care? And I think that has really sort of left me sort of like resonating, and I'm really grateful to Jordan's work for doing that, for sort of playing part of that and kind of awakening me to that. If you sort of, as we come around the corner, I don't think I'm going to try to sort of move everybody, but there on the wall as we go down on the left are some of the works of the Ohio-based poet and photographer Marcus Jackson. And Marcus modeled, though maybe I've now lost it. Marcus sort of modeled sort of a beautiful aspect of St. Amelia's kind of curriculum that mostly emerged in like the 80s and 90s, where the administration finally kind of recognized that it was like basically everybody who is in the environment of the college should be considered a professor. So whether or not you were actually employed as a professor of ecology or a professor of musicology, or you were a groundskeeper, or you were the head of the dorm, or you worked at the gas station down the block, you were a professor of the people who were at that school. And so one of the things that Marcus contributed in addition to these photographs is he contributed a poem that I believe kind of gets at the heart of that. So I'm just going to read that poem for you. It's called Pupilhood. My education might have peaked the autumn my schedule featured 3 genius teachers. Professors of refurbished rubber, of afternoon blue, and of pastoral textiles collectively. All 3 imparted conviction and tenderness. And at many junctures during their lectures and tutorials, my mind shivered with the veracity of birth. Having breathed the professor's brilliance, I'd re-enter the obligatory world and hear the warped rotors in my lover's car being a distant echo of cosmic disagreement. Or I'd stand in line at the bargain grocer and venerate the daylight angling from the street and venerate the mothers and children in the store who wanted with equal intensity to beat and to save each other. So I really appreciated that when I invited Marcus to be part of the show, that he chose to really honor that aspect of the college as well, to sort of say, like, let's break down a little bit of these hierarchical structures of who it is that imparts knowledge and who it is that is actually able to then experience that. Therein ends part 2. Part 3 is down the hall in the back of 4. What I wanted to touch on in here was a couple of things. One is there's a work by my mother-in-law, which is a piece by Aminata Conteh, and this piece is actually belonged to, and I'm going to get this right, Maddie. This belonged to Aminata Conteh's grandmother's sister's cousin's niece's daughter, who attended the college.
Well done.
Thank you. And what Aminata, when she at her artist talk, when she flew up, I love this. She flew up in the morning from New York. She gave her talk, and then she went back to the airport and flew back to New York. I mean, blessed. Amazing artist. If you don't know her work, please look her up. But basically, this work was created by her grandmother's sister's cousin's niece's daughter, because she came to St. Amelia's and wanted to find a way for African, the instruments of the African diaspora to be incorporated into Western classical music. And she found that the institution at that time was incredibly resistant to it. There was a particular dean who didn't want anything to do with it. So she took it upon herself, Aminata's grandmother's sister's cousin's niece's daughter, took it upon herself to start gathering together a collection of instruments and then manufacturing ones that she couldn't find herself. and basically sort of seed the college with this idea of celebrating the African diaspora. And so there are the only instruments that we know that have survived are the one that Aminata brought with her from New York, and then this piece here, which is a bowl lyre from that's believed to be from East Africa, and it was part of this collection that Aminata's grandmother's sister's cousin's niece's daughter was able to put together. The other reason I just wanted to, and this is sort of part of the synchronicity, I don't think we really planned this when we were curating the show, but this work here by Shaina Gates is riffing on some experiments that were done between sound and photography at the college. And it's based on work that emerges out of capturing vibrations that are done when music is played into different materials. And one of the pieces that was used in this was Professor Soki's undertow studies done in 1958. And one of the things that as I've been researching this, I've realized that Soki really attributes her ability to do the work that she was able to do with her students and even sort of technologically and creatively to the instrument collection that Aminata's grandmother's sister's cousin's niece's daughter was able to bring into the college. So I sort of love the synchronicity of that. The other thing I wanted to note was these two pieces over here by Epiphany Couch. We, a couple of, maybe 3 weeks ago, we had a number of young people from the Swinland Institute. And as I understand it, it's a program for folks, for young people who are on a gap year. And
I think they also do artist residencies.
Also artist residencies. Folks that are interested in, I think that if I'm getting it correctly, they are sort of prompted with the idea of like, how do you live a good life? That's sort of the prompt that they're sort of investigating while they're there. So we had a group of maybe, 25 students come here and wander around. And at one point, one of the young people came up to me and said that her mind had been a bit blown by this piece because she grew up, this young person grew up in Oregon. She's not native herself, the Epiphany is, the artist is. And she had never outside of Oregon ever encountered reference to the fish wars. And as Epiphany notes in here, the fish wars, which were the series of civil disobedience acts by Native American tribes on the Pacific Northwest that occurred in the 60s and 70s, it was very rare for the new information about that or for that to be taught at that time outside of the West, or even to be acknowledged by sort of dominant culture. And yet it was taught at St. Amelia. So here, this young person came over, and she was standing there with this other person, and she sort of reminded us, and she was like, I didn't know anybody else knew about the fish wars. And her friend was like, what are the fish wars? So then she could sort of explain that. And so it was just also sort of a wonderful moment. We've had amazing experience seeing how folks engage coming through the show. But just at that level, to sort of have this kind of confirmation of her reality, that she had really sort of understood this as being a really important part of her childhood landscape. And I think also really emphasizes this sort of question that lingers throughout the show of what are the sort of histories and then what are the fictions that we carry around with us? And what is it that we are sort of told, what are the fictions that we are given that kind of replace actual history, for example, the disenfranchisement of the Native American community who were having their rights that had been firmly established in Treaty 2 fish strategically taken away. Though in a rare victory in 1974, in United States versus Washington, District Judge Bolt actually found in favor of the tribe, for the tribes for that. So again, it's sort of, I love in this room sort of lingering with this question, with that question of what are these histories that we don't know are histories that touch anybody else, and then what are the fictions that kind of obliterate those and ask us to forget. Therein ends part 3. We're going to go back by the television for the very last. Actually, I lied. I absolutely lied to you. There's one more thing I need to tell you here, and it's behind my friend Steve. He's my friend and also my father-in-law. These works here by Fadl Fakhouri, who's a Palestinian American artist based out in LA and New York. They're beautiful works, but they've also become a bit of a kind of fascination for folks at the show, particularly on our opening night. There were folks that were encountering his work, but also what he wrote up about them, and became kind of certain that they had figured out who had actually burned down the college, which was not part of. It's not known who burned down the college. And as sort of a reminder, professor of dance Amara Brown famously said, as some of you may know, quote, "St. Amelia's burned, but no one died. Yet people continue to try to find out who did it. We can spend our time in other ways. Volunteer at a food bank, protest police brutality, create a dance for the victims of child abuse, plant a tree, run for school board, provoke justice," end quote. So a sort of good reminder that again, the question of what actually happened to the college, we're encouraged to look away from that more, to go back to the rest of the world. And I think that kind of resonated because also Fadl submitted this work, and as you encounter it, as you encounter the paintings, but also as you hear him talking about his time at the college, he's talking about Dr. Francisco, one of his painting teachers. And it's a really interesting mix, his narrative of this lightheartedness and kind of quirkiness of this experience, but also Professor Francisco's deep struggle with mental health that also overshadowed his experience there. So I think it's that mixture of things that I really linger on in Fadl's work, and also the fact that this work was being created. We created the show during a time of great unrest in the Middle East. And as some of you may know, the poet and ambient musician Saba Khouri, who was an alumna of St. Amelia's, was killed during the Israeli air raids in Beirut last week. And Khouri's experimental sound work, You Are an Unparalleled Music, remains for me like a startling testament to her activism and her kind of commitment to justice. And so the fact that, again, we have this lighthearted work from this Palestinian American painter being displayed at this time where there is a great deal of trauma and violence that is occurring in the world as well, is also something that I just really wanted to note. Now we are done with part 3. Let's go to part 4. The history of St. Amelia's, please let me know, because I'm trying to kind of complete as much of a kind of collection of the artifacts from that time as possible. I wanted to mention this is work by Lokotah Sanborn, who's a Penobscot artist, and when we were talking at his artist talk, we're talking a little bit about this reference he makes in his piece about the collection of what he calls experimental basketry that was created in the late 1800s by Wabanaki basket makers, that was displayed in the Hogue exhibition hall, but that again was lost in the fire. So one of the as it says in his, as Lokotah found a review in the Thrush Ledger, described the work as, quote, "weaving illusions that shatter temporality and space, bending the limits of 3 dimensions. These works of ash and birch seem impossible in their construction, defying logic and reason," end quote. And Sanborn mentioned that he was going to reach out to Gabriel and Jeremy Frey to ask about these lost baskets, because it got him wondering about this image in Jeremy Frey's exhibition at the PMA, where there is a moment when one of the baskets that he has been working on immolates and starts to catches fire and is destroyed. And the piece is called Ash. And there's plenitude of connotations that kind of can emerge out of that, sort of loss of Wabanaki culture or the loss of ash trees to the emerald ash borer. But Lokotah wanted to chat a little bit with Jeremy to sort of see if there might be some other resonances there, but also if they have any understanding of what these techniques were that created these seemingly impossible 4 or 5 dimensional baskets. The other thing I wanted to note, the only piece of art As I said, I'm not a visual artist. The only piece of art that I created for this show is this piece here. So this I created with my friend Martin Pavlinic, who was equally obsessed with St. Amelia's legacy. And it's based on a couple of different pieces of St. Amelia's lore. One is the antler antenna, which is up here, which was created by Professor Mari Nakalajarvi, who had an initiative to try to develop sonic apparatus that would counter Western attempts to quantify or disprove indigenous stories. So this was a piece. This is not obviously the original piece that she used, but that piece was used as part of the Quarry Hymns Provocation Project that's referenced in Adam Rosenblatt's zine. There's a scene in there where the members of Sad Bird Band are participating in the listening session. They are diving into the quarry and are holding the antenna there. So when Martin and I were designing this, we tried to create a resonant deer skull that would sort of mimic a little bit of that piece. The other piece of this that this is inspired by are the researches of Dr. Fiona Avery, who in 1986 traveled to Svalbard, the island of Svalbard in the Arctic, to test a theory regarding the sounds of the aurora borealis. And Avery used a variation on Nakalajarvi's antler antenna, but used antlers that were found from indigenous Rangifer tarndaris antlers that were found in the pyramid in Town Dump. And so Martin and I are sort of obsessed with sound, and we're obsessed with St. Amelia. So we created this piece, and there are three sound sources. One is the low-frequency transmissions or phenomena that are being picked up by the antenna. And then there's two other sound sources that come from archival work. And it was a joy to work on, and I was grateful to the other artists for allowing my little piece of visual art to exist there. Yes, yes.
Do you have any speculations as to if potentially this piece was drawing the aurora borealis to Maine recently?
Do you know what? The timing of that is a little spooky, actually. Yes, this was hanging. So I can't say with certainty that it was not responsible for that. So I'm not going to take credit for it, because also the sun had something to do with it. But I'll take half of the credit. I think the last thing I just want to say is that my own research, this has been an extraordinary experience to be able to put on this exhibition and to display some of these artifacts that I was able to gather, and to have these artists engage the visual artists that were contributed work, the musicians and sound artists that came out to the Zona Host evening, and it was an amazing evening of experimental, primarily experimental electronic music, and then the living room salon gathered for sharing works that were connected to the legacy of St. Amelia. So it's been a real joy, but I think this has just really reinforced that this is sort of the beginning of sort of my exploration of this college, and I think it also has just been reinforced. If you all wouldn't mind just going over there for a moment. That, as I said, there are these unidentified artifacts. So these are pieces that that people have told me came from the college. So I guess I really can't totally confirm it, though I trust. I don't think anybody's really trying to hook me. But so we have these different pieces, and I've not been able to identify them. So I asked folks that came to the exhibition if they had any ideas on what they might be, or if they had either a hunch or a certainty. And so folks have been leaving some suggestions. So I thought I would just read a couple of those. Because I think the sort of the kind of community, as Adam mentioned in Cemetery Citizens, the idea of sort of like being collective caretakers of the legacy of this space, again, whether that comes from joy or whether that comes from rage, I think is really important to sort of how we remember St. Amelia and the folks that were there. So for example, number 17, which is right here, this someone wrote, and no one signed them, which I kind of love, said this is a tombstone for a turtle. Turtles are entombed in found objects. The dead are buried standing. There is a glass window for the deceased to be looked in upon periodically to make sure the turtle didn't just retract into its shell. The screw enables the chief turtle to unscrew the escape hatch in case a mistake has been made. This one is identified as a throwaway camera that fell from space at precisely the time that St. Amelia's burned. It landed on the lunchroom roof. I like that they call it the lunchroom. The lunchroom roof, two students high on psychedelics were perched up there. They thought they hallucinated the fire and the falling camera. It was only the next day when they woke up in the hospital that they realized both incidents actually occurred. A nurse told one that she was clutching the camera when she was rolled into the emergency room. So again, it's just been really helpful to sort of have, again, these little pieces of lore kind of contributed. I mean, again, I'm not totally able to confirm that, but I'm going to be looking into it. Number 37, which one's 37? Oh, this one. Is an outsized yo-yo, the last and only remaining of a storied collection exhibited in Conhoning Hall. The lore is that it belonged to Abraham Lincoln, a tall man who painted many things custom-made to his size, even his toys. And this one here is a tool for measuring head size, although to what end can only be based on conjecture. That was sort of helpful. And this here, number 8, was piano keys turned into mountains. And then another possible identification here is an owl-sized mask for deep sea diving. There endeth my talk. Thank you all so much for coming. I would just like to thank all of the folks that made all of this possible. First is Maddie Vertenton for trusting in this exhibition. Thank you so much, Maddie. And thank you, Joe, for humoring us. I also just want to thank all the artists who participated. I want to thank Martin Pavlinic and Suzanne Zalazo, who's here, and Sarah Hamill for their guidance, and also thanks to my family. Yes, my daughter Mirabelle is pointing to herself, wanting to make sure. Amen. Thank you to you. Again, and to all of you for coming out and supporting. I hope you hang out a little bit more and drink the rest of the beer. Yes, Anne?
Colin, thank you so much. Before we disperse,
yes.
I have a question for you.
Yes, please.
It's really exciting to know that there are some other objects, some other artifacts from St. Amelia's that have come forward. And obviously we live in a land with a lot of flea markets, yard sales. So I was just curious, based on your research about St. Amelia's, how do you think we might be clued in that perhaps an interesting object at a flea market or elsewhere could in fact have originated at St. Amelia's? Do you think that there would be particular qualities or other sorts of telltale signs?
That's a really good question. I mean, I think a lot of them came honestly with little stories attached, even if they're sort of fragmented ones. I mean, this is Maung Dae's work is not an artifact. He's a Burmese poet and filmmaker. But his only direct connection was not a direct connection at all. His only connection to St. Amelia's is that when he was attending the Ajar Poetry Festival in Hanoi in 2016, he was out drinking on the street, and a woman came up with a bird on her shoulder and asked if he would like to purchase the bird. And he said, no, not this evening. And she looked very sad. And she said, I'm very sorry. And he said, yeah, I'm just not in the market for a bird. I'm not sure how I would get it back to Burma. And she said, well, he was born at St. Amelia's. So these little sort of fragments of narrative that I think sort of loiter around these objects as sort of as energetic. You can find all of those, the books in there, for example. Those are pieces that I've been able to find in used bookstores and flea markets and online that are from the Amekmate Library and can be identified by the, and if you need one to see it, I can show you the actual imprint of what that looks like, so you can keep an eye out for that.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.